Pleasure to welcome you here this evening. My name's Adam Tooze. I'm the director of the European Institute at Columbia University. And tonight's event on the Euro crisis, the Eurozone crisis 6 years on, is the first, we hope, in a mini-series of events we'll be hosting as the European Institute on the ongoing situation in the Eurozone. The next occasion in this series will be our hosting of Martin Sandbu, the well-known economics commentator for the Financial Times, who's launching his book on the Euro on the 17th of November, and Buiter has very kindly agreed to be a commentator for that event. So watch this space. That will be advertised in due course. This mini-series is made possible by a grant from the European Union itself under the rubric of the European Union's Getting to Know Europe programme. This comes, in fact, with the mandate that at some point in the discussion, the voice of the EU must be heard, and I hope that in the fullness of this evening's conversation, as it were, some of the logics that support and sustain the EU project of the Eurozone will become evident. We couldn't ask for a better opening for the series than tonight's lineup, which features three contributors, two speakers and a first respondent, who bring together a truly formidable breadth of academic expertise, expertise as policy advisors, and the practical experience of business economists. Our first speaker this evening will be Lars Christensen. It's a particular pleasure to welcome you to New York, Lars, who became famous worldwide in the course of the crisis as one of the world's most far-sighted emerging market analysts. He was based at Danske Bank, the leading bank of Denmark, which was itself heavily involved in lending in markets such as Ireland, for instance. But Lars was crucial in calling very early the likelihood of the collapse of the Iceland economy in a paper already, I think, from 2006 that you were pointing this out. And over the winter of 2008-2009, he was one of the most perceptive observers of the crisis in Eastern Europe, the precipitous collapse of the Polish currency, and then sounding the alarm in the Baltic. In fact, I was using data from your unit only on Monday as part of a lecture on that less well-known, but nevertheless, I think, crucial element of the expanding financial crisis of 2008 that spills over well beyond the boundaries of the Atlantic to embrace all of Eastern Europe, and the Scandinavian banks are very much part of that. He was also an early recruit to the ranks of high-powered economic blogging, and Christensen used his blog to coin the term market monetarism to describe his distinctive style of monetary analysis based on the pragmatic monetarism of Milton Friedman. As the founder of Markets and Money Advisory, he's now an independent economist, writer, consultant, and public speaker, a senior fellow of the Adam Smith Institute in London, and it's a very great pleasure to have him here tonight. Lars will be followed by Peter Garber. Peter had a distinguished career as an academic economist with a particular interest in economic history before joining the outstanding economic research team at Deutsche Bank. There he became famous as a leading contributor to the research group that in the early 2000s identified the new system of pegged exchange rates centered on the Chinese-US axis as Bretton Woods II. And it's an analysis which I think, despite the crisis raging in the Atlantic, has, broadly speaking, held up. That crisis, of course, extended across the Eurozone and after the winter of 2009-10 into the Eurozone itself, and had banks like Deutsche Bank at its center. Though we will not be quizzing our panelists this evening about their particular employers, and that is, I think, part of the reasonable rules of engagement this evening, I know from having traveled in Europe with Peter at the height of the crisis in 2012 that he brings a truly unique perspective to our discussion this evening. After hearing from Peter and Lars, our first respondent will be Willem Buiter. Willem is a global chief economist at Citigroup. Before joining Citigroup in 2010, he was known throughout the world as a leading macroeconomist, which brought him appointments at the University of Cambridge and the London School of Economics, as well as serving as an external member to the Monetary Policy Committee of the Bank of England immediately after it was granted independence in 1997, so during a formative period in the new history of the Bank of England, and as chief economist to the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development. And since 2015, we've been fortunate enough to have him at Columbia as a senior research fellow and visiting professor at SIPA. So it really is a delight, and please join me in welcoming our three panelists this evening. Lars, you take it away. Peter will respond, and Willem will come in third.
Thank you, Adam, and thank you for inviting me to speak at this event. It's truly exciting to speak about Europe in the US. It's sometimes much easier to be here to speak about Europe than in Europe. It's like when you speak about Europe in Europe, it's too much of a family affair, and we cannot always say who is really the rotten apple or the black sheep in the family. And so it is interesting to be here. I am particularly happy that Adam has invited me because I'm a great fan of Adam's work on history. And I think we can learn a lot of that from that work about what is happening now. And when we think about the present crisis that is unfolding in Europe, and the crisis is still unfolding in Europe, I must say that the echoes of the 1930s are there, and they're very, very clear. And if you were a Marxist, which I'm not, you could only make one conclusion, that we were on the way to something very, very bad geopolitically. I think Peter will help us interpret that. But you know, it's hard not to see the similarities between the present crisis and what unfolded in the 1930s, both in terms of how the crisis unfolded economically and particularly, in my view, monetarily, but also how it plays out in terms of the political response and the political crisis and the rise of European populism or nationalism across Europe. So there is a lot of similarities to the 1930s. I hope that we will break away from those similarities. Historians like Adam will hopefully help us to understand that question. But at the core of what I will be saying is that I think that we should try to reevaluate the whole idea of how we think about the crisis. I could have had this presentation about how I think we had the wrong view of the US crisis, which we initially called a subprime crisis and a debt crisis and all that. My argument will be that the crisis that is unfolding in Europe and this crisis that is called the Great Recession has very little to do with debt. Debt is the outcome of the crisis, debt problems is the outcome of the crisis rather than the cause of the crisis and at the core of the crisis. And unfortunately, policymakers in Europe do not really grasp that. So there's a lot of Calvinist ethics to what is going on in the way we respond to the crisis in Europe. I'll try to get into that without being too sarcastic as we go along. What's the standard view? The standard view of the crisis is that it's a debt crisis. It's all about, again, here comes in the Calvinist ethics of the whole thing. We had 7 fat years, now we'll have 7 lean years. It's terrible. But that's really not a real crisis. But let's see, have a look at it. Here is the debt to GDP ratios of a number of European countries. It's public debt. I stole these numbers from my friend David Beckworth. David is a fellow market monetarist and I must admit have very, very similar views to mine, or the other way around. But take, for example, a look at Greece down here. Greek public debt, yes, right, it's around 100% of GDP, but it was not rising prior to the crisis. There was no sign that debt was becoming unsustainable. Even for some countries, take Belgium, it was declining. The Netherlands, it was declining. The reason for this is, of course, is there are 2 factors in debt to GDP. There is the debt, and there is the nominal GDP. And what really happened was this. This is good, because there you can only see one of the 2 graphs on the slide, which makes it much better. You can see the black line here is nominal GDP relative to its pre-crisis trend. It collapsed. You can't see the other graph, we should be there, which is debt to GDP, which move in the opposite direction. But I will show you now in the next graph. But that is really at the core of the crisis. It's the collapse and the contraction in economic activity, broadly speaking, more specifically in nominal GDP in Europe, which is at the core of the debt crisis. The debt crisis is the outcome of the collapse in nominal GDP, not the cause of it. And I will argue that the crisis we've gone through in Europe is all about the euro. It's not about lazy Greeks or evil French. You know, you can actually use Uber in Paris these days. I did it recently, and it works perfectly fine. There was a bit of strikes going on before that, but it's possible. It's not about that. It's not about too much regulation. It's not about all of the things we've been talking about. I am no great fan of the Northern European welfare state. I am no great of French-style regulation or Italian firing and hiring rules or French pension schemes. But the structural problems of Europe is not what caused the crisis, and it's not why Europe still has significant problems. The failure lies in the euro itself. It lays in the idea that one size fits all, and one size do not fit all. And a way to illustrate that is looking at real GDP growth. I could have taken nominal, but you know, let's take real. This is the change in real GDP from 2007 until 2015. I have taken 31 European countries. The green ones are countries with floating exchange rate, and the red ones are countries with pegged exchange rate or euro membership. There are two pegged exchange rates. It's Bulgaria and Denmark. The rest are in the euro. Bulgaria and Denmark are pegged to the euro. What do you see? Well, half of the European countries with pegged exchange rate or euro membership have lower real GDP levels today than in 2007. No wonder that the European electorate are angry with their politicians. They might be wrong at the wrong institution, meaning government rather than central bank, but the point is that you had tremendously negative performance. There are a few outliers. Lithuania is actually a more statistical coincidence, because the crisis in Lithuania started in 2010, 9-10 rather than in 2008-9. So if you look at that, disappears. Other than that, it's small countries. But see, half of all the Euro countries have had negative GDP growth throughout since 2007, while all of the countries with floating exchange rates in Europe have higher GDP today than in 2007. Is that a coincidence? I don't think so. I'm a Dane, so let's say something bad about my own country. Denmark have had a pegged exchange rate since, well, 1875, with the exception of 2 years, 1931, 1932. But has been in the present kind of setup since the start of the euro, really had the same kind of peg since 1982. This is a Scandinavian country, or Nordic countries. It's Denmark, Sweden, Norway, Iceland, and Finland. It's the same as before, but just let's illustrate it. This is the real GDP levels indexed at 100 at Q4 2007. There are two countries with pegged exchange rate or euro membership, Finland and Denmark. I'm particularly happy that Anne Sippert is here today, because Anne and I have a common interest and heritage or legacy in terms of Iceland. See Iceland, which had a banking collapse on an extreme scale in 2008. Those who have involved in that remember that as something truly horrible, both in terms of banking management mistakes and policy mistakes. It's unfolded in a dramatic fashion. But if you look at Icelandic real GDP, today, Icelandic real GDP is higher than real GDP in Finland and in Denmark, despite of a total banking collapse. What's the difference? A floating exchange rate, monetary policy sovereignty, that a country can conduct monetary policy to the needs of the country. It's extreme. I think that particularly Finland is interesting here, because Finland is a country which is doing all the things that the Calvinists in the Netherlands and Germany are saying. or in Denmark, or in Sweden, or in Finland themselves. I use the term Calvinist in an economic sense, not in a religious sense. It's a way of bad-mouthing my own heritage.
Probably Lutheran, right?
Well, it's right for the Netherlands, not for Denmark or Sweden. But well, they can be put into the same category. They are lucky to have a floating exchange rate. But see here, Finland has performed terrible. In fact, Finland has performed so terrible that the crisis in Finland is now deeper than during the Great Depression. It is deeper than the Finnish banking crisis of the 90s, where Finland was hit by both a banking crisis and a collapse of the Soviet Union at the same time. This is the scale of the problem in Finland, but they've done all the right things. They're very austere. They're doing all the right things, according to the EU Commission and the ECB, and the head of the Bundesbank. Let's look at another example of the same thing. Turkey and Greece, two neighboring countries, known for political instability, geopolitical uncertainty, often involving each other, by the way. Both countries, this is real GDP per capita. Going back to 1980, the countries performed quite similarly until 2001, where something happened. Both countries changed direction dramatically in terms of monetary policy. Turkey had a major crisis in 2001. As a result of that, had to let the currency float, which had then turned out to be a blessing, while Greece joined the euro in 2001. And until 2008, things were developing quite similarly. But then see, after 2008, Greece has performed horribly, and Turkey has performed so-so. Turkey has really tried to perform badly. You have a war in a neighboring country. You have a president that increasingly is acting in an authoritarian fashion. You have major corruption scandals. Every 6 months there is a rumor of a new military coup. All these things. And I'm thinking, how would Turkey have performed since 2008 had Turkey had a pegged exchange rate? Well, my argument would be that we'll have had banking crisis every 6 months. Would have ended in a government default. But it didn't. Instead, we had every second year, we had a 30% devaluation of the currency, or depreciation, I should say. Has that been great? No. Has things been unstable politically, monetarily? Yes. Financially? Yes. But there has not been the same kind of massive macroeconomic and financial collapse as we've seen in Greece, because the exchange rate serves as that shock absorber. And that brings me to the next issue. I'm naturally not a Keynesian, but when I look at the Eurozone, the interesting thing is that a monetarist and a Keynesian analysis of the situation is completely the same. So you have the two most important macroeconomic schools in the past 100 years agreeing on the causes of the crisis, and despite of that, policymakers don't listen to either of these schools. What it is that it's about demand. And the Keynesian perspective, we want to focus on fiscal policy. And what I've done here is I looked at the fiscal stance of the Eurozone countries from before and on the floating exchange rate countries in the Eurozone, the same 31 countries. I should say I've used a simple average. So Germany and Denmark among the peggers and euros are the same. But just to show it, this is the change in the fiscal stance. So an increase is fiscal easing. A decrease is fiscal tightening in percent of GDP. What you will notice is that it seems like there seems to be quite a bit of coordination in Europe. We seem to have the same fiscal policy. By the way, pro-cyclical fiscal policy. When things are good, we ease. When things are bad, we tighten. Which is the best argument against any Keynesian argument, is that it's politically not leading to the right thing. But see here, the peggers and the floaters started to tighten monetary policy in 2010-11. That was the initial response to the crisis. I don't think it's about right or wrong. It was just simply a question about, are you running out of money? There is no other choice. It's not about having the right policies. If nobody will fund you, you have to tighten fiscal policy. And everybody in Europe did that and have been doing so in generally since 2010. However, how about the outcome of this? This is the debt level to GDP. See, the green line is the floaters, the red line are the peggers and the Eurozone members. We have been tightening fiscal policy since 2010. What have happened to Eurozone debt? Just continued to go up. While in the floater countries, since 2011, we have seen stabilization. By the way, if you put in America, put in the US, it will be similar to the debt developments of countries like Poland, Turkey, UK, Sweden, declining debt levels, moderately so, but declining nonetheless since 2010-11. Why? Well, the reason is this. There is a link between the development in nominal GDP and debt to GDP. See here, I'll now argue that Germany has been no more austere than Greece. In fact, Germany has been less austere than Greece. This is the change in public debt as share of GDP. And this is the change in nominal GDP, both for 2007 to 2014. You will see Greece is directly on the regression line here. Germany is slightly below, so okay, maybe a little bit more austere. But in general, the relationship is one that if your economy collapses, your public finances worsens dramatically. That's the story. And who are in charge of controlling nominal GDP? The ECB. Nominal spending growth is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon. The ECB can set whatever level for nominal GDP it wants. It cannot set whatever level for real GDP, but it fully controls nominal GDP. In fact, if tomorrow we had a press release that Mario Draghi had stepped down as ECB boss, and new ECB boss would be Gideon Gono. I'm sure you all know who Gideon Gono is, the central bank governor of Zimbabwe. I'm sure that the market reaction would be rather violent to that. Would you doubt in any second that Gideon Gono was able to increase nominal GDP in the Eurozone? We would all agree he could do that. He could increase it by 1 million%, 2 million%. He has a good track record for doing that. I think Paul Krugman talks about looking irresponsible. He talked about Ben Bernanke showing up in a Hawaii shirt. I don't agree with everything Paul Krugman says. Actually, most things I don't agree with. But he's completely right on that. Monetary policy works. Monetary policy controls nominal GDP. We can print as much money we will, and we can increase nominal GDP as much as we want. There is no liquidity trap. If there were a liquidity trap, meaning that in some way we couldn't increase inflation because we are zero lower bound, why do we have taxes? If we can print money without any impact on inflation, that would actually be great, because then we should just abolish taxes and print money to finance all our public expenditures. And we all know that the result of that would be hyperinflation, and that's exactly why we don't do it. My argument is that what has happened is that the Eurozone has been reluctant to ease monetary policy because there has been this perception that monetary policy was already very easy. But here I want to quote Milton Friedman. Milton Friedman said about Japan in 1997, when Milton Friedman advocated quantitative easing for Japan, interest rates are low, not because monetary policy is easy, but because monetary policy has been tight. Because if monetary policy is tight, you have low growth and low inflation expectations, and that is why you have low interest rates. Interest rates were not low in Zimbabwe in 2008 when the country had hyperinflation. They were high. The relationship between nominal interest rates and inflation and growth expectation is consistently positive rather than negative. So the idea that we should focus on interest rates is completely wrong. We should focus on expectations of growth and expectations of inflation, of nominal GDP expectations, and that can be determined by the central bank. What happened then in 2011 was that the ECB forgot what is on the first page of the central banker's textbook: ignore supply shocks. Oil prices rose dramatically in 2011, among other things because of the Arab Spring, the tsunami in Japan that created extraordinarily high demand for energy. And that pushed up headline inflation in the Eurozone. And then ECB Governor Trichet, eager to prove that he was more German than the Germans, hiked interest rates twice. And that caused a rise in European unemployment of around 3 million people. I do think that you should blame the ECB for that. If you look at a graph, and I don't have it here, between the development of unemployment in Europe and in the US from 2011, it's a very, very scary testament to the failures of the ECB. And that, to me, is at the core of this. Good news is that Mario Draghi, the present ECB governor, seemed to understand that. But he's not able to do anything without the concrete or implicit acceptance of the German Bundesbank. And that makes it hard to deliver going forward. And I must admit, I'm a little bit worried that we recently have seen inflation expectations, both in the US, because I think the US, another day we'll have that discussion, because I think the US is failing rather dramatically on the tightening side at the moment, that we have the problem. And we are seeing inflation expectations, I have it here, inflation expectations both in the US and in the Eurozone beginning to come down now. By the way, if we just want to mention the European or the US situation, this is 5 years, so there's an inflation expectation about inflation in 5 years and then 5 years ahead for the US from the swap market. Rather dramatic decline in 2000 actually since July 15, when Fed Chair Janet Yellen testified in the US Congress and said, I think we're going to hike interest rates this year. And since then, inflation expectations have been declining. That illustrates, by the way, that the importance of monetary policy is expectations, or what I have called the Chuck Norris effect of monetary policy. You know, when Chuck Norris is doing arm push-ups, he's not lifting himself, he's moving Earth. Monetary policy can do the same thing. A great illustration of this is the fiscal cliff in 2013 in the US. The Fed had introduced QE3. QE3 is a really bad term for what they were doing. They were actually becoming much more clear on their monetary policy rule. The Fed was telling, essentially, the markets that if there is a setback in nominal GDP growth, measured in the US as the sum of unemployment and core PCI inflation, then the Fed would step up quantitative easing, and if things improve on that, they would do the opposite. So the market knew that if the fiscal tightening of the fiscal cliff would lead to a slowdown in aggregate demand, the Fed would offset that. As a result, the market was completely unaffected by the fiscal cliff. It was only Paul Krugman and a few other Keynesians who were very upset about this. But nothing happened. Why? Because Bernd Bernanke at that time, finally, after years of struggling with the FMC, had come to define a rule for monetary policy. So you can't do that. The ECB, however, did something different. At the height of the crisis back in 2010-11, the ECB started to talk about making conditions for easing monetary policy. Meaning we are telling the markets that if Berlusconi wins in Italy, we're not easing monetary policy. Or if we don't have a new government in Greece, we're not easing monetary policy. Which you are, and that, by the way, saying to the markets, we conduct monetary policy based on a rule. And the rule is we want to have Eurocrats in power in different countries. Meaning that election or opinion polls actually became monetary policy. Because once you get More support for Syriza in Greece, or God knows in Italy, who knows in Italy? One other clown than the other. But that's actually a fact. That's a popular thing. We also had a clown party in Iceland. Then that becomes determining of monetary policy. Luckily, I think we have moved away from that in Europe. We have moved away from that. And that is why, in my view, that the Greek crisis have not had bigger spillover effects this year than it had. Because there is an expectation now in the market that, that any shock in Greece would be offset by more quantitative easing from the ECB. They got it pretty damn right in January. However, that does not change the fact that one size does not fit all. And that is at the core of the problem within the next 2 years. Imagine that the ECB continue quantitative easing, the recovery in Europe continues. Then in 2 years, we will have property prices in Germany going up by 15%. We will have 6-7% wage growth. We will have 3-4% inflation. We will have a sharp drop in the current account situation. Those of us who have been screaming for that sort of thing would say, that's just fine, that's what we need. But the Germans will be very upset. And at that time, they will no longer accept monetary easing. And we'll get that shock interest rates hike of 200 basis points, 2 percentage points, or whatever. And in that situation, Spain blows up, or Greece, or whatever. So we haven't changed the fact that the euro is a monetary union that by no measure is optimal. And therefore, at the core of this is that we have forced upon Europe something where we said we all have to be the same.
Lars,
yeah.
Can at that point I bring Peter in to expand this out to the political side?
Yes, maybe I just very short just show how the difference is between Germany and the rest of Europe, just to illustrate it. Because I understand the German anger. What I've done here is the blue line is the actual monetary policy rate in Germany prior to the euro, what the Bundesbank has, and after that, since 2002, 2001, the euro rate. And the red line is the so-called Mankiw rule. It's similar to a so-called Taylor rule based on an estimate of inflation and unemployment. What should interest rates then be? And you can see the Mankiw rule fit German monetary policy quite well until 2008. And now it says that German interest rates should be 7%. I don't really believe that's to be the right number, but it illustrates quite well the differential in what, because if we did that for Greece, it was at -10.
Yeah.
So that is the point, that Germany needs to have much tighter monetary policy, or likely soon would have that. And now I want to lay up to Peter, because I have prepared that for him. I haven't. That's how it stopped. No, and I think that the graph I wanted to show you was the level of political uncertainty in Europe has increased dramatically on the back of that. And that is where Peter takes over.
Excellent. Thank you very much.
Thanks for that smooth handing of the baton. There are two dimensions to the euro. One is the economic dimension. It was originally sold as a means of increasing the efficiency of the European Union. Transaction, you didn't have to worry about foreign exchange markets. Transactions would be a lot less costly. The banking systems could merge, so a lot of inefficiencies could be smoothed out of the system, and that was one reason to have the euro. And so you can go from there into the economic issues surrounding the euro, as Lars did. But there's also the geopolitical dimension of the founding of the euro. And not just the euro, but the European Union itself. And I'd like to discuss those and the elements of those, the development of those, of the geopolitics of this crisis, both internally and externally. So European unification itself has always been about the geopolitics in the inward and the outward direction. The drive for European unity started as the result of a final revulsion against World War II, but also against 1,500 years of incessant warfare in Europe that had continued since the end of the Roman Empire. And it started, the unification of Europe has evolved constantly effectively in one direction for the last 65 years, starting with the European coal and steel community in the early 50s, and then moving into the European economic community, a broadening effectively into a common market of the original European coal and steel idea. The European coal and steel community was about sharing of the coal and iron resources in Western Europe, basically between France and Germany. These were the foundations of the heavy industrial economy at the time and of any war economy, and the struggle for these resources in Alsace-Lorraine and in the Saar and the Ruhr. Those were all part of the larger struggle between France and Germany. The European coal and steel community was organized as a supranational, effectively, to share out in a reasonable way access to those resources. The common market was formed as customs union. Then it evolved quickly into the European community, which was a broadening away simply from the economics into other areas of the relationships among the countries of Europe, and then finally into the European Union by the beginning of this millennium. Part of the European Union itself, which was founded in the Maastricht Treaty, came about, part of that was the establishment of the euro. And most countries in the European Union, or the majority of countries in the European Union, joined the Eurozone, the single currency. And now this evolution towards unity has coincided with an unprecedented 70 years of peace in Western Europe, unprecedented in all history. And, but the first 40 years of this coincided with the Soviet-US occupation during the Cold War of Europe. But the last 30 years or 25 years since the end of the Soviet Union, has been in the absence of this external pressure towards cold peace, I should say. And since the end of the Cold War, the unification of Europe has proceeded on its own momentum, although still under the US security umbrella. The second rationale, geopolitical rationale for unification of Europe was external looking. It was to create a ultimately a supranational entity which could punch at the same weight as the superpowers, the US and the Soviet Union, and then after the collapse of the Soviet Union, more and more the superpower China, not both economically and possibly in a geopolitical level. Aside from its economic aspects, the euro was to be the device which would accelerate the unification of Europe towards a federal European state. It was and is still strongly believed that currency without a state is fundamentally unstable. But this actually strengthened the rationale for why a single currency without an overarching state should be developed. That would be the horse that preceded the cart rather than the cart that preceded the horse. In creating this instability, or perhaps because of the economic effects of a single currency driving the markets of the individual states closer together, that would lead the way towards federalization of Europe and a federal state to complete the supranational in Europe. The euro itself would lock its membership in and force the centralization of key markets, financial markets, and decision-making and regulation. There was a word that was used along with the euro. It was irreversible. So that once you're in, once the currencies were locked in their exchange rates, you didn't get out. Although there was no real provision or penalties for getting out, there was no provision for getting out. And so, therefore, once you're locked in, now you're part of, ultimately, of a super state. And it was only left to time to develop the institutional arrangements for that federal state. At its base, though, the euro was geopolitically initially about the effects of German reunification and the effects that would have on the rest of the European community. German unification was the ultimate realization of German grand strategy since the Adenauer government, where Germany would be with the West, it would not go neutral, as long as the West would guarantee the ultimate unification of Germany. And that was realized in 1991, initially over the objection of the French and the UK, with the strong support of the Bush #1 administration. But the way to smooth the path was to establish the euro, eliminate the Deutsche Mark, harness Germany into the overall system, and therefore diffuse the overwhelming power that Germany would have, and keep it from being the destabilizing force that power had been in the history of the 20th century. But the incomplete nature of the euro itself and of the European state system itself was the ultimate source of the euro crisis. The euro was perceived to be unstable, and it turned out to be a perceived unwillingness to do what was required of it through of the member states through a fiscal system of fiscal transfers to hold the system together, drove the not quite standard balance of payments crisis that lasted from 2010 to 2012, and again broke out in 2015. We heard about the reluctance of the ECB itself doing what it's supposed to do under the strong moral control of Germany. In the current crisis, the current financial crisis and Greek crisis has come to a temporary end for several months, for a few months at least. We'll see whether it breaks out again. But in a not quite hoped-for way at the time of its birth, the euro crisis did lead to further centralization of Europe. We have more centralized fiscal control of the budgets and taxation system and deficits of the individual states through the fiscal compact. We have a banking union of sorts, which we did not have before, which has created centralized supervision of the banking system, and therefore pulled the local banks away from the supervision of local state authorities, which could then twist the supervision to their advantage. We also have an institution for the a permanent institution for the recapitalization of problem banks via the European Stability Mechanism. There's also been a self-enhancement of the activities of the ECB to almost achieving Fed-like powers, if not behavior, which to implement effective transfers to and from the governments of the system via its liquidity interventions and by its more general policies now of bond buying. And also a strong policy statement that the ECB will do whatever it takes to hold the European monetary system together. That is, in the existential crisis in 2011 and 2012, that was brought to an end ultimately by the ECB realizing that its existence was at stake if not just Greece failed, but Spain and possibly Italy and maybe even all the way to France. If those were hit by massive liquidity crisis and they failed, then the ECB was dead. So although the ECB was created simply as a price stability rule, monetary rule, I guess the conclusion, the constitutional argument would be that if you do not exist, then you cannot stabilize the price level. So you have to do whatever it takes to do that. So there has been serious developments in those dimensions. But to move to the other dimension of geopolitics, not just the internal, but the external geopolitics that has now overtaken the Euro crisis. Coincident, but not caused by, but coincident with the 2011-2012 phase of the Greece and Eurozone crisis, Europe and the US have lost control of the south shore of the Mediterranean, which had been a 30-year project, security project, both by the Europeans, basically mostly the French, and the US, to establish a tier of countries all across North Africa and even into the Middle East and Iraq, which was if not supportive of, at least under the control of, or cooperative with the countries of the West. That fell apart in 2011, 2012 with the Arab Spring. Simultaneously, we saw the disintegration of Iraq and Syria, and now that has led to a major intensification of the Sunni-Shia conflict. These are in the neighborhood of Europe. Basically, the whole southern flank of Europe is an area of conflict now, whereas Europe had been born and effectively insulated in an era. The Eurozone had been born in an era of stability and relative peace. It's also seeing now a Russia, Iran, Syria, Iraq alignment that threatens to surround the Sunni oil producers who are chief suppliers of Asia, but also of Europe, not necessarily of the US. The expansive effort of the EU into Eastern Europe and especially into the Ukraine to draw the Ukraine into its sphere has been resisted by Russian military force now. And there has been a Russian pushback all along its borders with the EU as a result of the retaliatory sanctions that the EU has implemented along with the US. All of this is occurring at the same moment that the US has become reluctant to put itself in the middle of everybody else's fight. That is a policy of the current administration that will last at least for a year and a half, and possibly into the next administration, whichever party it is that takes over. Afghanistan is also crumbling as the U.S. withdraws. The U.S. just announced today that it would leave 5,500 troops in Afghanistan. What they will do, it's not clear. On the way out the door. So that creates the whole, an entire new issue in the refugee dimension. Evidently, the U.S. is making certain that its generalized security umbrella for what used to be its key areas of interest is now that certainty of that umbrella has now become uncertain. That applies also to the EU and to NATO. I'd like to refer back to a statement, the valedictory speech that Robert Gates made in 2011, where he warned the NATO countries, the other NATO countries, that the lack of proper military funding for NATO in the EU is leading to a decline of will to continue U.S. support for NATO in the post-war U.S. generation, the post-Cold War U.S. generation. That would be anybody that was born basically since 1975. Once you that's how. So anybody 40 years old is not necessarily in support. But there's more to the point. That was a warning of what he saw going on at the highest levels of the U.S. administration at the time. So all of a sudden, the umbrella that the U.S. had provided has become problematic, to say the least. Now, at Deutsche Bank, I guess I'm not supposed to cite ourselves.
No, please do.
In 2010, the general view in research in Deutsche Bank was that Greece in particular would be kept in the euro by finding whatever small amount of money it took to keep Greece in via various slush funds that exist all over the EU, just to keep the ball rolling and not create a crisis where a few bucks would save the day. At least it would push it off for a few years longer into the future when Providence would provide the solution. That, by the way, that was not me. I thought the German fiscal Calvinism would drive Greece out simply as an example to the rest.
Germans are Calvinist and Lutheran.
I'm sorry, but Calvinism was brought up. German financial probity.
Willem is now an economic term, not a religious term.
No, it is about religion. But probity is the word that I'll use then. So ultimately, by pushing the problem off into the future, ultimately that meant that the problem would be resolved by political shifts. Either might be a political rebellion in the creditor countries in Germany or in the debtor countries such as Greece. In most countries, though, center-right and center-left were strongly pro-European Union, pro-Euro, so it didn't really matter what party was actually in power. It would only be over the course of time as the left wing and right wing ate into the middle of their electorate, and that would take many years of pain to happen. Ultimately, it did happen in Greece this year, but it was to no avail. The crisis effectively in the euro emerged from the realization, and the crisis, I mean the existential crisis, the balance of payments crisis, emerged in the euro because suddenly it became clear that the word irreversible that had been thrown around by the authorities was simply an authoritative incantation and not an objective reality, not a reality that had been embedded in the institutional arrangements. In 2011 and 2012, the perceived cost, both economic and geopolitical, to the system of a breakup was too great. So because of that, institutions, which I outlined earlier, were created and means were found via the various bailout programs to hold the system together. But Greece stayed in depression, and this brought the politics to a boil. The recently agreed Greek program, the third Greek program, forced or bribed Greece to stay in for at least some months more. It's not clear whether this is a short-term tactic or a long-term strategy, either on the part of Germany or on the part of Greece. We'll see. A little bit more geopolitics. It should be recalled that Greece, via various Syriza government officials, let it be known that it would open the door to problematic migrants into the rest of the EU if there was no a satisfactory settlement. Greece also flirted with Russia for support, financial support, and perhaps more geopolitical support. Although Russia, because of the sanctions and because of the collapse of the oil price, is strapped for funds now, because of the Ukraine, it seems to be, it was cautious about embracing what might have been the bottomless pit of Greece. Although Russia has evidently now decided to keep its Mediterranean foothold by intervening in Syria. That wasn't a cost too high. Greece probably was.
That's quite telling.
Greece has great naval bases. Yet another program might have once seemed to Germany like another softening in fiscal probity. But in the light of the worsened geopolitical situation to the EU's east and south, stabilizing Greece economically and politically can now be viewed as a security issue and therefore cheap for the result relative to a more aggressive military response. But now, today, Europe is deluged with ever more refugees from the regions that are in turmoil, from which the flow will not stop. Yet another wave. The word has gone out that it's great to be in the rich countries in Europe. Cell phones. It used to be that in the emigration to the US, it would take 3 months to cross. The life there was not so great. It was better than in Europe, but it would take another 3 months for the message to get back and to organize the family to come and the rest of the village to come. Now the emails go out instantly, so already the follow-up waves are en route. So this will not stop unless there is a serious EU intervention in the countries of origin. Some kind of intervention, financially, militarily, has to occur to block the door. This refugee crisis has also revealed yet more German imperiousness and has added even more centrifugal tendencies in the eastern zones of the EU to those already existing in the UK and even in Bavaria. So all of this together, all this geopolitics together, is starting to force the dropping of the petty economic dispute that has ruled the euro crisis till now, and is giving priority to the geopolitical dimension. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, the unification of Germany, and the securing of Gulf oil because of the Gulf War in 1991, external geopolitical threats to Europe disappeared for 20 years. This gave the European community, as it was, the breathing space to become the EU, European Union, and also to espouse soft power over hard power. In the geopolitical vacuum of a weak Russia, the EU took the opportunity to expand rapidly to the east while centralizing itself internally to some extent. So therefore, the Confederate European community morphed into the not quite federal European Union, which morphed into an imperial union with its eyes on Ukraine. But now that free ride is over. The US, at least for another year and a half, will not provide much of an umbrella. And the still incomplete union now has to develop policy much more through a security lens than it has ever had to do before. So to invoke the always relevant, the Godfather, wasn't enough time, Michael. Wasn't enough time.
Thank you. Willem,
All right.
you've
Well,
been
I have the pleasure of being able to disagree with both speakers. I will start with the politics because it's my areas of greatest incompetence, so I'll be most assertive about that. Where I find myself in broad agreement with what Peter said, and also the way Lars started, where he pointed out that the present crisis in the EU as a whole, not just the euro area, is reminiscent in a very unpleasant way of the 1930s. Populism, nationalism, subnationalism, splitism of existing nations, xenophobia. We know the great European record in handling minorities, right? We tend to kill them. That solves the problem, of course. And this is why the migrant refugee crisis is so important, why Brexit matters, and why, indeed, I think, even a sort of fairly technical and intrinsically not wildly important issue like the success of the monetary union matters. To me, monetary union matters mainly because a reversal of an EU integration process which was presented as irrevocable, as an unbreakable bond, when it gets revoked and broken, there is immediately the question, who's next? Who's next contagion? Not just within the context of Euro exit, but in the context of reversing other European integration processes. No, if Greece did go out, then I think the odds must be that they will at some point either be booted out or sort of drop out of the monetary union. This has, I think, cross-issue contamination in making Brexit more likely. If the UK leaves the European Union, the risk of a wholesale disintegration of the European Union, the restoration of 29 nations, my ultimate nightmare, right, would be material. So it really matters. Now let's deal with some of the other policy issues. The drivers of the European Union indeed were prevent war. Europe had produced in just 50 years 2 world wars, contributed in a major way to the Great Depression, brought forth fascism and communism and Nazism, and had the Holocaust. So it was a good half century. And then it happened, people got together, and for 70 years there was peace. And that is such an enormous achievement that no matter how ugly Brussels is, and how irritating little technocrats in, in Brussels are, it is something that you have to cherish and stick to, because the collapse of the EU would be like the collapse of Yugoslavia, which was actually a proper federal union. War, civil war across the board. Even the Soviet Union, it was not even technically a federal union, it was really a unitary state almost. No sooner broke it up that Armenia, Azerbaijan go at it, Russia and Georgia, Russia and Ukraine, civil war in Moldova, civil war in Tajikistan. The EU member states would not be different. So it is incredibly important to show us kept on the road. So successfully preventing war, creating a successful supranational entity, I would say complete failure. We're not imperial in Europe, not even federal. I don't think we even confederal. We have some elements of federalism, little sniff. There's a parliament, sort of, right? There's a Supreme Court. The European Court of Justice actually has real powers. And so that actually is probably the most important entity in the European Union. Then we have this strange proto-executive, the Commission, which actually acts like a legislative. It has legislature, so it's a weird creature. And then we have the sort of the second, either legislature, the Senate, if you want, which is the heads of government, heads of state, but they also have executive power. So it's a bit of a, a Horlicks. It's sort of very much a common law political union. Very strange for something dominated by the French and the Germans, that they would go about institutional design in this very Night at the Improv way, but that's the way it goes. It's not designed from scratch, I can assure you. Nobody intended this. So, but it failed to do the things that so the middle requirement of even a confederacy. Common defense policy, common diplomacy, and I would say actually a common currency would be very helpful. Economic integration, some success. We're supposed to have free mobility of capital, goods and services and labor, the four freedoms. Technically, we have free mobility of labor now. And the UK has been an enormous beneficiary of it. The actual number of people that moves is limited because of linguistic and cultural reasons, but there are no legal obstacles to any European citizen looking for work in any other nation. I think it's a huge achievement. And if that dies as a result of Mr. Cameron's initiatives, it would be terrible. For goods and services, we only have a 20% union. 80% is the service sector, and we only have a monetary union for agriculture and for manufacturing goods. So we have a 20% union. We could do the other 80%. It would be nice. We have for capital, it's very dodgy, right? It's hard to have, we have free capital mobility, but not a capital markets union with a common rule book, common regulations, common supervisions of non-bank institutions, and common taxation. So we're a long way away. Do we need strong, and this I'll come back to later, much stronger centralized union to make the monetary union and indeed the EU viable? Not really. I will explain the minimum required to keep the monetary union in place. I'm a federalist myself, right? I want to have Danish and French taxes, Italian, French and Greek labor market regulations, the German talent for defeat mechanisms, and British infrastructure, right? So that would all be wonderful. We don't need it to have a viable union. We don't need a deep fiscal union with a common federal budget, for instance, and large cross-border transfer mechanisms to make monetary union work. Just very brief on the external dimension of geopolitics, neither Europe nor the US, I agree, plays any role in the Middle East, in the Maghreb, or on the borders of the former Soviet Union. The refugee crisis in Europe is, in my view, actually just a precursor of what would have happened even without the civil wars and wars in the Middle East. It's simply the demographics and climate change that will send tens of millions of migrants, mainly from Africa, but also from Central Asia and the Middle East, into the European Union sooner or later. It was accelerated by the conflict. 2 weeks ago, I was in Belgium, was told by some experts that there were 1.5 million people on the beach in Libya, and 4 million on the way. Not actually from Syria, mainly, but from Yemen and places. And since Russia intervened in Syria, there's an estimate that 3 million more Syrians will become refugees. And they all want to come to Europe for obvious reason. And the reason that they're coming through Greece is not because of Syriza having decided to threaten anybody, but simply because the Greeks have no control of their borders. Right? Even if they wanted to, they couldn't stop it. So the refugees, in my view, are potentially a huge long-run positive for Europe. Right? We have a big demographic deficit that could fill it for 2 generations. And in any case, homogeneous societies are both boring and lack innovation. It is true that this immigration will create cultural, religious, political, and other tensions, but they are manageable. And if we don't manage them in Europe, I don't think we deserve to survive, and we probably won't. So that's the good news. There is a risk of disaster if we don't handle this well. And of course, it feeds the populism. It makes Brexit more likely, even though it's technically not related at all. So, and in Europe, it is indeed the end of the free ride. We're going to have to come up, I think, with a common defense and external diplomatic policy. Without that, I think the exercise won't survive. Now, let's come to the serious disagreements. And that's, I disagree with almost everything that our friend Lars said. Except, of course, that Iceland was a really good training ground. And both and Seibert and I, and he wrote pieces on that before the place came apart, and it was just a textbook exercise in asking for a crisis and getting one. Now, the Great Recession, that is the outcome, not the cause of the crisis. Wrong. He only looked at public debt. What you have to look at, of course, is combined sort of non-financial private sector, household, non-financial corporate, and public debt, or its counterpart, the financial sector balance sheet. And of course, that was exploding in all the vulnerable countries before 2008. In Ireland, in Greece, well, in Greece it was the public debt was exploding. The private sector did too. In Spain, in Portugal, in the Netherlands, in the household sector, in Denmark, household sector, in Sweden, household sector, and all that. And what we have had since 2007 has been, in Europe, an increase in the overall non-financial sector debt burden, and a major shift towards the public sector, right, from the private to public sector. So, and we're going to see the same thing happening soon in many emerging markets, where there's been a similar explosion of debt relative to GDP, but all in the private sector. And that will then, of course, as it did in Europe, ultimately migrate to the public sector, because the overly indebted entities are either too big to fail or more likely too politically well connected to fail, right? And they will therefore have the usual transfer of bad assets to the public sector. The collapse of nominal GDP describes the crisis. It's not an explanation. It's not about the euro. The US and the UK had a similar problem. The euro is deeply messed up and contributed to the crisis, but it's not having a common currency per se that did it, just that this common currency is very badly designed, and until recently, even within the bad design, very badly managed. Right? And now Mario is doing the best he can with a very bad toolkit. But it's better than messing up with a very bad toolkit, which his predecessor did. Is the euro a problem because it's one size fits all? No. As long as we have national fiscal flexibility and national, even subnational, macroprudential stabilization, we can handle the adverse consequences of a single currency. And you cannot have unrestricted capital mobility, right? Without having a common currency, right? Unless you happen to have a global reserve currency. In that case, you can get away with it. And so European nations basically had no sense. Floating exchange rates, in most cases, when they are as likely to be a net contributor to instability, a source of instability, because it's not a messy asset market if it's left free to float, and or as a shock absorber. If you manage the exchange rate, you have a better chance. But certainly unrestricted capital, you can't have the free capital mobility and have anything but a common currency or a global currency. Monetary union is not a problem. Bad monetary union is. Icelandic real GDP, yes, it has recovered after a huge dive. They didn't just have a floating exchange rate, they had capital controls as well, of course. And that's illustrated. And in addition, we are talking Coventry here, right? 300,000 people. So I'm no doubt I can find a city somewhere in the euro area that has really done well. And Iceland had a very flexible real economy, very unlike the most Eurozone entities. And so it's more like Ireland in that sense. Right? And Ireland, of course, has also recovered now spectacularly. Finland, basket case, yes. Why? Russia exposure and the collapse of Nokia. That's the main reason. That makes it worse than the rest of the European Union. And pro-cyclical fiscal policy. Not imposed by the minions in Brussels, but by what I would call Teutonic fiscal policy, self-inflicted. Teutonic in the generic sense of people who believe, A, that expansion in fiscal policy is contractionary, B, any monetization of deficits leads to hyperinflation, and B, C, there are irresponsible borrowers without irresponsible lenders. Right? That's the German triad, the Teutonic triad, I would say. Now, Turkey, example, it's about to fall off the face of the earth, right? So you were just a bit premature with showing how well it did with its own currency. It's also an emerging market, right? With enormously favorable demographics and therefore much higher growth potential than Greece, which is a submerging market, right? And so therefore you can't really compare them. Turkey couldn't have done better with a pegged exchange rate, that's for sure, but they could have done better with a properly managed common currency. The fiscal strangulation has been part of the problem in Europe. Policy has been severely pro-cyclical, and I agree with the diagnosis that the consequence that counter-cyclical fiscal policy is almost politically unmanageable in the upswing means that you're likely to build up debt to such an extent that you can't use it properly in the downswing, even if there is nobody in Brussels saying tut-tut, right? I mean, it wasn't Brussels that stopped Greece from borrowing. It was the markets. Okay. So remember that the debt that matters is the total non-financial sector debt relative to GDP. And some of the worst cases there, and crises still to come, are in Sweden, in Denmark, in Canada and Australia. Again, two countries that got off lightly in the crisis. Household debt, and to a lesser extent, corporate debt has exploded on the back of sustained property bubbles. Sure, if the economy collapses, the public debt to GDP ratio collapses. And that's why I think debt restructuring will be an inevitable part of the solution. For some countries, there were public debt restructuring. In countries like the Netherlands, was another one with excessive household debt. Sweden and Denmark, I propose basically the equitization of household mortgage debt. Basically, switch existing mortgages into what would be Islamic mortgages. They're basically equity rather than debt, and that's what households should have. Right? It's a crazy instrument for the entities with the least economic flexibility, ability to borrow and lend, to take on debt, which is it should be an equity type liability, and it is under a common equity or a Islamic type mortgage. Can the ECB control nominal GDP? Wish they could. Certainly the governor of Zimbabwe couldn't. The two conditions under this monetary policy is ineffective. The liquidity trap is what we're in at the moment. In Europe, you're never in a pure liquidity trap. There's always something you can do to push rates down epsilon more, and if you shuffle it out long enough, you will get some further compression of margins. You may get some effects to the exchange rate, but it is de minimis. Transmission to the real economy, even if you could cut rates, wouldn't be there because the second reason for monetary ineffectiveness, the famous vertical LM-IS curve, right? Interest insensitive aggregate demand. And with very high debt, especially in the private sector, that's what tends to happen. Highly indebted households and corporates do not respond to the normal interest rate incentives. So, which monetary policy works? Well, the monetary policy that Uncle Friedman recommended, which is in fact a combined fiscal and monetary policy. It's helicopter money. Right? A temporary fiscal stimulus permanently funded by the Treasury selling bonds to the central bank and the central bank monetizing it and keeping that forever. That is equivalent to the central bank buying the government debt and cancelling it. Right? So, and that's what I would recommend that we do in Europe. But it is therefore not monetary policy alone. It is the fiscal spending increase or tax cut that it funds that you need. And that works both the vertical LM curve, horizontal LM curve, liquidity trap, and interest-insensitive aggregate demand. So the ECB, as I said, the Mankiw-Taylor rule, whatever you said, of course, was complete nonsense for because showing that Germany would need 7% interest rates now, right? Well, they would look like Greece if that was the case. So that's just a question of misfitting. Now, what do we need to make monetary union work in Europe? It's very simple, right? There are two solutions. You either go, by federalist route, and you have a proper monetary union, as described in a minute, a single central bank, not 18, and you have a serious redistributive federal budget. That's about as likely as me being the next pope. And I am a Calvinist, so. Now, what do we need? What is the minimal fiscal union and further we need, in addition to what we have, to make monetary union effective? To keep the EU alive, we need the common defense and external and diplomatic service, but monetary union. We need a sovereign debt restructuring mechanism that allows us to restructure sovereigns at the speed of crisis, rather than the torture that we saw in Greece. And I would propose that if we do that, that the large liquidity fund, the super ESM, that accompanies it, conditional, of course, be only allowed to lend to a distressed sovereign if, to the satisfaction of some independent body, the debt of that sovereign has been restructured to be sustainable. So do what the IMF failed to do, right, with Greece in 2010, when they said, when they invoked, they said it's probably sustainable, and anyway we have the systemic risk exemption, right? They did a Pinocchio on their noses, right? It was dreadful. So, and we need some independent body, a bunch of tame academics from other countries who make a binding decision on that. Not the central bankers, not the politicians. They are contaminated and not consistent. A big liquidity fund also, with access, if you want, to the central bank, with a credit line to the central bank, to shovel it out once you have restructured the debt. We need banking union, and we're getting there. The one real success story is this. If you told me 3 years ago we'd have as much banking union in Europe as we have now, I said, come on, pull the other one, right? But we have the ECB as the single supervisor of 108 largest banks. They're technically the supervisors of all Greek banks, which is kind of fun.
How well do you think they're doing?
Well, terrible, because this is example Europe. They have passed the BRRD, the Bank Resolution and Recovery Mechanism, or some such thing, which basically has the great rule that you have to bail in at least 8% of the balance sheet of a bank, of the liabilities, before you can put any public money in, your own or somebody else's. Now, with Greece, you have the first test. Banks are bust, right? But what did you do? Well, the BRRD doesn't kick in until January 1st. So the ECB and the politicians are trying to get this whole thing agreed on before January 1st so we can bail in the taxpayer instead of the creditor. It is an insane missed opportunity. And then, of course, even the existing Commission rules, which says you have to bail in, wipe out the equity and the subordinate unsecured creditors, even that won't be stuck to because some equity will be saved, provided enough new private equity comes in. And again, I think that is a shocking abdication of responsibility and encouragement of moral hazard. We need, therefore, the single supervisory mechanism. We need to separate the national sovereigns from their national banks, and more generally, their national systemically important financial institutions, not just banks. I use banks generically here. So what does that mean? Risk weighting of sovereign debt, right? using normal commercial criteria, concentration limits on each bank's holding, exposure limits of sovereign debt. So no more stuffing of national banks with unwanted national debt, with insolvent sovereigns dragging the banks down, or insolvent banks dragging the sovereign down. That was the last one, was the Irish example, and the first was the Greek. Important also here that is full risk sharing by the ECB. The way they got QE off the ground was saying, well, you know, the Germans buy German debt, the French buy French debt, the Italian central bank buys Italian debt, and then if there are losses, they're for your own account. If you push that to the limit, and they are trying, right, you don't have monetary union anymore. You have a system of currency boards. Individual central banks can go bust in this case. Become ineligible as counterparties in Target 2. And it's insane. So we have to get away from that. I know it's the only way to get the Germans on board and the pseudo-Germans, the Dutch, but I think they should have held their... The Dutch are Germans with wet feet, right? Yeah. When it comes to banking. And football will be much worse. Yeah.
Willem, on that note, should we bring the...
just tiny little more thing. We need the ECB as lender of last resort and market maker of last resort for all systemically important institutions and for sovereigns. So exit Article 123, the non-monetization. Right? And we need explicitly to give the ECB a triple mandate. Right? Price stability, yes. Full employment, yes. But the most important, financial stability. And with that, we can make it work.
Thank you very much. So with a heavyweight panel like this, you always have the risk that it's going to be a heavy and substantial evening. But we do have some time for questions, and I think it would be great if we could collect perhaps 2 or 3, get some short, gentlemen, really short responses, and maybe then do one more round, and then wrap things up for the evening. So do we have some questions from the floor for the panel in response to these rich presentations? Yes, here, Dale.
Let me take big picture questions.
And speak loudly, please, for...
I'd like just to, because you touched on it all, you less and more, the political pressures now being put on Europe from Russia and from immigration, be it from Africa or elsewhere, are already substantial.
Mm-hmm.
They could get more substantial.
They will.
What do you think Europe is ready to do? I was recently in Berlin and told by government folks there that had the United States, for example, insisted on putting Western equipment into the Ukraine, they would have lost Germany on this issue.
Yeah.
Okay, so that doesn't leave a lot of play space, and I think the Russians have surprised people a bit with their move into Syria, how well coordinated, et cetera, it is. They're showing they can be even more difficult. So, you know, time, it was one of the points Mr. Garber made. You know, we're trying to deal with these problems as if we had unlimited time. Do we?
A couple more questions. Do you have some? Here, Anne.
Getting back to Iceland, I realize that this is a footnote, but it's such a fun pathology. And anyway, you brought it up.
It's not on.
It's closer, just closer to you.
Ah, okay. Would you really advise a country like Iceland that it would be better off outside of the euro area and this restrictive monetary policy? A country the size of Aurora, Colorado, really shouldn't have a central bank, I think. When you think about implementing monetary policy, if one of your operational people is on vacation and the other one gets sick, monetary policy...
That happened,
I think it might have. Monetary policy doesn't get made that day. And a country like Iceland is so small, and it's not easier to make monetary policy in Iceland than in a big country. There's a distinct shortage of available policymakers. And if the choice is Trichet and a monetary policy that's not designed for Iceland, or David Odson and your own monetary policy, what would you pick?
Can we have one more? Yes, from the front here.
I know what the Icelandic press will pick up on.
So my question would be, in a 10 or 15-year horizon, what policy do you see effective towards Ukraine?
So maybe we could have one answer each. So maybe Peter could take the Ukraine and the Dale's question here, and then either of the two of you can weigh in on the Iceland question.
On the Ukraine and German attitude, so the German industry is not sympathetic to the sanctions at all. And so there's not just in Germany, but other countries that are strongly affected by, say, energy issues or are already sympathetic to Russia, such as in Hungary, even before Ukraine. So any great pressure on to further pressure Russia would probably fall apart in Germany. One result of this all may well be of the migrant crisis and the Ukraine could well be that Germany swings over to Russia and contracts Russia to solve the security issue with the migrants. That's a plausible outcome. So basically, NATO then falls apart, and Russia then becomes the frontier country that goes gunslinging all over and protecting Europe. I can see that.
I really think that's extremely unlikely. Russia is a sick old country, right? It is Saudi Arabia with nukes, right? And they can therefore throw their weight around, but they cannot sustain persistent effort with the economic sanctions.
Lift the sanctions, and then you only. I mean, it's not as if you're marrying Russia. You use them for some years.
But Russia has won in Ukraine, right? So and it will. Peace has already more or less broken out for the last couple of months, and they won't want to fight on two fronts. Syria is more important than Ukraine. Russia's got a Crimea forever. They got a federal solution for the East, for the whole of Ukraine, that respects Russian minority rights. And Ukraine is in such bad shape that it couldn't join either the EU or NATO for 20 years if they wanted to. So I think this is, so Putin has won, and at some point he'll declare victory.
Lars, you're in favour of independent, autonomous monetary policy and flexible exchange rates. Is there a size limit on this? And Anne's provocative question is, Iceland may be too small. Is this a sliding scale? When is too big? When is too small?
It's an excellent question for the Friedmanite, who always say that naturally floating exchange rate is the best thing as a general rule, but there are exceptions. And I think that would be the Milton Friedman way of seeing it. They're like, okay, but Hong Kong has really benefited from a currency board, etc. And I'm happy that Anne actually brought this question up, because I did a presentation in Iceland back in January on the future of the monetary regime in Iceland. I spent an hour talking about this issue without giving an answer, which is highly uncommon for me. First of all, because I knew my words have some weight in Iceland, and I didn't necessarily want to provoke that discussion, but rather I wanted to lay out what the trade-offs are, because we don't necessarily have choices, we have trade-offs. And the trade-off is one of, on the one hand, having a monetary policy that certainly do not fit Iceland, because Iceland is not like the European Union. It's a resource exporting economy, is heavily depending on that, on fisheries and on aluminium production, so general cheap energy in Iceland. On the other hand, it's a village in economic sense, and fully correct. It's in many ways, there's a human capital problem. There's simply a lack of enough economists to run a central bank, and I think that the Icelandic central bank in its present setting would fully acknowledge that. So that trade-off is there. And my inclination on that question is that yes, there might be an argument for another monetary regime than a floating exchange rate in Iceland. However, that alternative is not the euro. It might be, as some in Iceland has suggested, the Canadian dollar. It could also be a basket of currencies. It could also be, a Jeffrey Frankel kind of pegging the exchange rate to the export price, so having some kind of inclusion of commodity prices in their basket. I think that these things probably are in general preferable for Iceland, because I wouldn't suggest splitting up the U.S. into 50 or 100 different currencies, even though we could fit that many countries into the U.S. But in general, there are that trade-off. So in the case of Iceland, paradoxically, I would argue, in the case of Iceland, I'm probably more inclined to some kind of currency board or completely getting rid of the currency at all. And for my own home country, Denmark, get rid of the peg exchange rate and float the kroner. That trade-off has to be taken into account.
Thank you very much. Let's have another round of questions if we can. Do we have some more from the floor?
Denmark has the worst of all possible worlds.
Yes, here.
Right?
Absolutely.
All the disadvantages of
It seems to me that one of the issues that we talk about is the lack of political unity. And the lack of political unity has created many of the monetary and fiscal problems with the lack of consensus, with the strongest members, Germany, being able to rule the roost, so to speak, and call the tune that's being played. And it seems to me that unless, and you gentlemen have pointed out the differences, and it seems to me unless we have a political union, you have a political union in Europe, you will never really have a truly functioning central monetary system like the Federal Reserve and the controls that we have here in the United States. And I'd be very interested in your questions. I mean, it seems to me that, a lack of frustration that the monetary easing that we had here, the quantitative easing, the exchange rate, the lowering of the interest rate went on and on and on. And in Europe, it took forever to seem to want to get there. And to anyone sitting on the outside, I always thought to myself, why are they taking so long? And of course, it's all these member states that couldn't quite agree.
Well,
Anyway, I'd be interested in your comment.
Oh, sorry, there's multiple questions.
Do we have a couple more? And then we'll so we've got two more, the two gentlemen at the back, and then we'll do one final round of answers.
I've got a two-part question, if I may.
Yes, by all means.
With the indulgence of the panel. We've got a period of deleveraging going on inside the Eurozone, both public sector and private sector. Where do the panel, and of course, crises come and go, and we don't yet have a complete banking union. We've got bits of legislation in place, but it's going to be years before the whole thing is effective. So my first question would be, where does the panel see the next private sector crisis coming to confront the Eurozone? What needs to be done for it? And the second one would be, as an avid reader of Willem's team's forecasts on the probability of Grexit, if there's a successful progress review first time round with the first program review in the next month or two, what do the panel think will be the probability of Grexit after that?
Excellent question. The last one over here.
I'd like to ask the panel. Yeah. I'd like to ask the panel whether, in the worst case, the alternatives facing the EU and the Euro are a complete collapse on the one hand, or a retrenchment or turning back of the clock in either of two dimensions, either dropping or reducing the area of the euro on the one hand, while keeping member states that had been euro participants still in the EU with the freedom of travel and employment and customs, etc. Or in the second dimension, having countries, member states completely drop out of the euro and the EU and reducing the EU to something like its original core of more northern European states.
Thank you. Great questions. three of them. So, who would like to begin with the answers?
I'll address the question on how well functioning as a central bank the ECB is. On paper, it has all of the, most of the necessary powers of, say, the Fed.
It does not.
The problem is that, and if you look at the Fed, it's possible that you get board members or members of the Open Market Committee who are wildly at odds with each other and therefore stall the implementation of policy. It happens that they most of the time see pretty much eye to eye on the big picture.
It did happen between QE2 and QE3. Right? There was
but
a hiatus there.
It didn't stall for very long, though. Whereas on the governing council of the ECB, there's just there is a block that are strong money advocates and a block that are weak money advocates. And I always have thought, on paper, the weak money advocates have the voting power to overrule the strong money advocates. They just respect the power of the strong. They don't want to drive the strong money advocates out of the euro themselves. So they tend to be ultimately there's an implementation of fairly easy monetary policy ultimately, but they just delay it too long. I mean, the interest rate is zero, and they are pumping out a lot of money now. And that is totally at odds with any German view of proper monetary policy that has ever existed. So
not ever. I mean, the Germans made
1923, yes. Ever, you're right. Yeah.
Indeed.
Yeah. On Brexit, they'll probably pass the first review because there'll be no information that will make it clear that they are not implementing either on the fiscal austerity measures or on the structural reforms. But this can't be fudged for very long, I think. So somewhere halfway through 2016, it will be clear that they are wisely not delivering on the additional austerity, and they are unwisely not delivering on the structural reforms that they should be doing, even if nobody told them that. So we're going to have a rerun of the threat of de facto expulsion by cutting off further funding. They got that close to being out this time. I still don't know how they stayed in. I think Schäuble thought they were out. That's my theory. And when he woke up in the next morning, he found out they were still in. It was a huge mistake. But yeah, so I expect that they will go out, and that Greece will continue to, since they are, from a monetary point of view, whatever the advantages of a well-managed independent currency are for a small country like Greece, they will grotesquely mismanage their monetary policy, and it will be like Zimbabwe. And so they are at risk of becoming a failed state. I think more likely they will, and drop out of the EU altogether, more likely, no, very unlikely, but the good outcome would be that they have the deep structural political reforms that they need to become a 21st century or even a 20th century country. And the most likely is to become a de facto protectorate of the European Union, which don't want it to be the transit point for ISIS into Europe, or don't want the Peloponnesus to be turned into a Russian base. And so they'll keep on transferring enough money to keep the border guards more or less in place and to make Greece resist the temptation to turn the harbor over to the Russians. And it will become like Appalachia in the US, right? Some people work on the beaches, and the young and talented leave, or like the Massif Central in France, where the average age in the villages is 75 or something like that. I think that is the most likely outcome.
Lars?
I think that we basically talk about this, all the questions here centers really about the issue of disunity in Europe. And I actually misheard the question whether it was Brexit or Grexit, whether it's the Brits or the Greeks leaving. But that doesn't really matter. The interesting thing is that, well, given my Euroscepticism, that is often in Britain taken as I'm a European or skeptic of Europe, which I'm certainly not. So nobody should expect me to campaign for Britain to leave the EU, because other than the Eurozone, what do we have left other than the horrible agricultural policies? We have the internal market. We have the fantastic internal market, which is the greatest success in Europe. Has been a tremendously positive story. And with Britain leaving the EU, we're jeopardizing that. That would really, really be extremely problematic. But I can understand the British frustration with the rest of Europe because of the rest of Europe's interventionist socialist tendencies. The problem is just that those advocating Britain to leave now are no longer Margaret Thatcher anti-Europeans, but of the kind of UKIP, which is much more based on anti-immigration views, which is something completely different. This is as separate, you know, UKIP and Margaret Thatcher are as different as Donald Trump and Ronald Reagan. And here there's a good guy and a bad guy. But in terms of the lack of political unity, it comes to me from the euro has created that. And again, Milton Friedman had warned against this. When we push upon it, this monetary strangulation mechanism, we get a political backlash. We could have had a successful internal market with floating exchange rate within that market. Instead, we had to do the whole thing because we wanted to create a European superstate. And now we've got political dissonance. Now we've got the hatred and the incompetence then to handle any crisis. When Willem is suggesting that, well, it could all work if we just did this and this and this, that's what Harold Damses called the nirvana fallacy. We are comparing the actual situation to what could have been if we just designed it correct. But we didn't, and we won't. So, to me, there is huge risk of continued disunity. And with that also come all these political negative situations. It's extremely concerning to see people in the parliament in Greece wearing uniforms and showing the swastika. It's extremely concerning to see the same thing in a country like Hungary. By the way, with a floating exchange rate, I will admit that. Or Jeremy Corbyn, who represents the most insane Marxist ideas that ever came out of Britain. That is the political reality of political discourse in Europe today.
Well, Engels came from Britain, right?
Gentlemen, we could go on all night. So this has been
We
absolutely fascinating. Thank you very much for coming. Thank you very much for being here and giving us such an interesting